Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, bringing you the latest news from Taiwan. I'm Annie Kuhl.
I'm Rath Wang. India is now the world's most populous nation. The South Asian country's population exceeded 1.428 billion, surpassing China's 1.425 billion, based on April data released by the United Nations. We'll look at what this means for the region as Taiwan and other countries look to diversify out of the Chinese market.
Joining us today are Lai I-chung, president of the Prospect Foundation, former Taiwan diplomat in both Japan and the U.S., expert in Taiwan, U.S., Japan, and China relations, and Sana Hashmi, postdoctoral fellow at the Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation, a policy think tank focusing on Taiwan's cooperation with Southeast and South Asia. Sana is a native of India. Warm welcome back to the show.
Apart from being the world's most populous nation, India is also on track to become the world's fifth largest economy, with a whopping annual GDP growth rate of 6.7%. President, has India become an alternative to China?
Not yet, but there's a great potential for India to be. And of course, India has all the potential that could be the alternative to the Chinese market. First, about its population, and then the amount of population. We're talking about the use of this population, which is very different from China, for example. And India also has very skilled laborers, especially in terms of the IT sectors, that could complement what Taiwan needed. And also there are other areas in the scientific and high-tech cooperations that India can provide very high quality, the knowledgeable workers.
Do you feel the proficiency of the English command is also a big thing for?
Oh, you mean the India? Yes, it is. But I think that if you really just trying to compare the India, sometimes the people in Taiwan would take the comfort more in terms with the Philippines, for example. Philippines more in tune with the United States. India, its English proficiency and the system itself is more allied with the United Kingdom. Although still English per se, but there are still some tiny differences.
But do you think at the same time, like what you said earlier, India with its more populous, with its youth, the age, and also English proficiency, and also technology background, do you think it's also a very ideal place for investment for most of the Taiwan businesses?
Potentially it is, but India is also, due to its democracy, and there's a long history about the diversified kingdom and the cultures in Indian subcontinent, which means that there are all kinds of rules and regulations for Taiwan businessmen to navigate among India subcontinent, and that has been very difficult for a lot of Taiwan businessmen when they try to invest in India. And this is something that the Taiwan side still need to work more about it, as well as to get more familiarity with what the India represents.
How do you think we can improve that?
It requires both sides to really move toward each other. And so far, I'm not going to say that it's India's fault or Taiwan's fault, but there are a lot of complaints from the Taiwan businessmen in India about the complaint they have about a certain the promises that the Indian, especially the state government, promised but they did not deliver, or the promise sometimes they use all kinds of the illegal English loophole in order to that is what they expected and what actually present to them are two very different things.
Even with these differences, do you feel, Sana, since you're from India, that this provides an opportunity to move out from China, given how much, as Dr. Lai mentioned, the potential, the youth, the IT talent that you probably won't see in China?
There's definitely a lot of potential. It's an opportunity, specifically when both India and Taiwan have talked about decoupling from China. And President Tsai's new southbound policy is actually about reducing dependence on the Chinese economy, and we have seen that in India as well. Since 2020, after the Galwan clashes, India has been trying to decouple from the Chinese economy. So there's a lot of potential, there's an opportunity, but I also agree with Dr. Lai that we haven't really seen the outcome yet. The utilization has not been there. There's a lot of opportunity, but are Taiwanese businesses ready for India? And I don't think so. as in they are primarily looking at Southeast Asia. If they are diverting away from China, I think the easiest way is to look towards Southeast Asia than India. But definitely in the near future, I see that there's a lot of potential, and perhaps both countries would find alternative to look towards each other.
What's a good starting point, though? As you mentioned, they see Southeast Asia first, but there's huge potential within India.
As in you mentioned in your remarks about the English training, but of course Philippines is there, so there's definitely another alternative, and Taiwanese businesses also go towards easier options. But India is the largest, most populous country in the world now. India is the largest democracy and is the fifth largest economy.
Right.
So sooner or later Taiwan should look towards India. Then IT sector is there, and I know that everyone keeps talking about semiconductor. India is reaching out to Taiwan in the field of semiconductor, but Taiwan is not really touching the issue of semiconductor when it comes to India.
Although there's been some progress with Foxconn, with EVs and building new plants there.
Right.
And all.
I think they've always been there in India, especially for a very, very long time, but this is mostly American business. But where is Taiwanese inclination, where is Taiwanese business? We don't really see it. So unless TSMC goes to India, I don't really see anything that's going to take this relationship forward in the field of semiconductor.
Probably we do have to see like a bigger action taken in place in order to have the rest follow suit. But Sana, you just mentioned earlier about decoupling. See, that's a very interesting word, because in G7 recently, they have actually shifted from decoupling to de-risking. So how do you think India can play a very important role compared to other BRICS countries, to the US at the moment and in the future?
I think, first of all, there's no comparison, because specifically China and Russia, most of the countries have this fraught relationship. But India stands on its own merit. I've already told you about that, how India is the most populous country in the world, is the fifth largest economy. So definitely there's a lot of potential in terms of how countries are looking towards India in the field of economics. But then there is a need, first of all, we don't really know what de-risking is. But we just know that it's less controversial than decoupling. But
Right.
India hasn't really talked about de-risking, because India has been talking about decoupling, and if India tomorrow starts talking about de-risking, that actually means that India is also just repeating the talking points of the West, of G7, which India doesn't really want to do, because India follows strategic autonomy. So India, even if it doesn't still talk about decoupling, but India is still on the path of decoupling. But to ensure economic security, India is definitely one of the most important partners for major economies in the world. And to counterbalance China, you need India.
How do you see, this is for Dr. Lai, how do you see China retaliating if India comes or pivots even slightly closer more towards the US and democratic allies here?
No, I do not think that China actually has retaliated against India for the economic action that India has leaning toward the United States, or another strategic redirection of its diplomatic actions or military actions. I think if you compare Chinese behavior vis-a-vis United States and the Chinese behavior vis-a-vis India, you could see a very interesting differences. That is, in China, despite what the United States calling China that we can compartmentalize our differences, we'll compete in military or in other fields, but we can still cooperate in the climate change and other economic field. But the China just ignore the United States, continue to insist that everything needs to be linked together. But in terms of the China-India relation, it is Chinese that is asking that why don't we just put aside our border issue differences, and we can concentrate on other issues. But India continue to insist that no, without solving a proper management about the border issue, the China-India relation cannot be normalized.
Is this because you feel India is taking a harder line? Like, say, if you look at TikTok and all these other apps that many in the West are trying to ban but haven't successfully banned, India has already done that. So China does not play well with countries that come hard on it.
I do not think that's precisely that's due to the India is an hardline actions toward a certain economic item by China, but generally I believe that China is fixated in terms of its competition vis-a-vis the United States, and the belief that the United States is in all-out competition against Beijing. And so that China just cannot afford to open another front, whether that's in the European or the Indian subcontinent. So that China continue to insist that they want to manage the China-India differences in a manageable way, which means that for them, to Beijing, they want to do the exactly same thing as compartmentalizations of the China-India relationship, so that they can share the differences, continue to work on other areas that can cooperate.
Do you think there's going to be a lot more bilateral conversation between the two nations in the future, from China's perspective?
I doubt it, because India right now they believe that since the Galawan incident that caused the bloodshed, and there are over 20 Indian soldiers casualties there.
Right.
So that India, I think this time, believe that China already violated its earlier commitment, and India would like to see this issue to be fully solved, or at least managed by China before they can move on other areas.
And President Lai, as you mentioned earlier, we don't see any sign of retaliation from China, right? But if, let's say, India is pivoting to the more like-minded U.S. or other
India
democratic
already
countries.
pivot more likely toward the United States, for example.
Right.
But it is precisely because of the competition vis-a-vis China that India also believes that it needs the Russia. And also Russia in the past has a track record of providing continuously without any hiccup about the arms that India needed. So that's why India, in my view, in the Russian war on Ukraine, continue to take a very different approach vis-a-vis the West, and continue to resist the call to really condemn on Russia. And I think this strategic rationale for India is precisely because of its competition vis-a-vis China.
Sana, do you feel that Russia, in terms of courting India, will India eventually have to say no?
As in, I think it's not in India's hand, it's in the hand of the West. There was always mutual distrust, but now we are seeing that India is actually reaching out to its Western counterparts, like-minded countries. So I think that's happening, and India is already trying to diversify from Russia, and India has maintained a somewhat neutral position. It's not towards the Russian side. In fact, if you look at it, India, the phrase by Prime Minister Modi that this is not an era of war was adopted by G20, and now also we saw a lot of discussion around that during G7.
Rad spoke earlier to Alex Capri, senior lecturer at the National University of Singapore Business School and global supply chain expert. Capri frequently contributes his expertise to the agendas of the World Economic Forum. He spoke about India and Taiwan's role in global supply chain realignment.
Do you feel India could play a role here in replacing the Chinese market as countries and companies move out of China?
India has been in that position for years now, where people have asked the question, will or can India supplant China as a major manufacturing hub, as a major hub in global value chains? I think at this point, in certain instances, with a lot of investment, with a lot of concerted efforts on the part of very, very large companies like Samsung or like Apple, that put a lot of effort and money into moving their first and second tier suppliers over to India. With the exception of a few of those, I think India still has a really long way to go to be in a position where it could supplant China. I just, in terms of, its infrastructure, in terms of its labor pool, in terms of, its connectivity, India remains very challenged in that regard. Having said that, there's no lack of effort on the part of the U.S. and its allies, Taiwanese companies, to be looking at India as an alternative. But at this point, even stuff that's made and assembled in India, a lot of the components are still coming from China. I'm not saying that it can't happen or that it won't happen, but it's going to require a heck of a lot of concerted effort in the future to continue to grow or to push high-end manufacturing to a place like India. Just so many challenges that I've mentioned.
You also mentioned Taiwan Although it's not a part of IPEF, it's a critical part of the US-led supply chain. What do you feel its role will be given that there's intensifying competition between the US and China?
Although it's inconvenient for Taiwanese companies because they built such incredible critical mass in Taiwan, around supply chains and production, and even as we speak, even with all the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, we're seeing companies moving R&D into Taiwan, right? Foreign tech companies, including ASML, right? The maker of chip manufacturing equipment and applied materials, right? So, it's a bit of a paradox, but Taiwanese companies are very much welcome and very much desired in these new situations where you have reshoring and where you have ring fencing of strategic industries on a regional or a local or a so-called friend-shored basis. Of course, we see that with TSMC investing not only in the United States, but starting to invest in other countries as well, right? Japan and elsewhere. I think Taiwanese companies are going to be deeply entrenched in what I would call a major correction to the global economy, which we're undergoing now, or a major process of reglobalization.
Apart from the Quad and G7 members, we've also seen South Korea actively work to deepen economic and strategic ties with India. President Yoon Suk-yeol held many meetings with Modi at the G7 summit in Hiroshima last month. President, what is behind President Yoon's motives?
I believe that the Korea's engagement with India started way back, not just because of the President Yoon, but it has been the Korea's policy, especially since the Asian financial crisis. In 1998, Asian financial crisis first hit the Thailand and then the great number of the Southeast Asian countries. But at the same time, South Korea also was hit hard. And then after the Asian financial crisis, the International Monetary Fund started to come to Korea with a structural adjustment demand for the South Korea. And South Korea at that time started to look for other available markets for its products. And unfortunately, at that time, the Southeast Asia basically was occupied by Japan. So the South Korea started to look at India for the possible alternative. And of course, similar things also happened to some of the smaller the company in Japan who cannot be competitive against its major competitors in Japan in the Southeast Asia. So they also went to the India, for example, like Suzuki cars, which in Japan, basically everyone's talking about Toyota, the Honda. But the Suzuki is a number 3 or number 4, found its own life in India. You go to India and you found out it's Suzuki and homemade, the Indian car that's running everywhere, become the biggest brand in India. So I think the South Korea engagement with in India has this history, and so the Yoon Suk-kim basically is following this trend, and also would like to take advantage of the current readjustment about the global supply chain. Many of them were shipped to India, and so as part of the big supplier within the global supply chain, South Korea definitely would like to take advantage of this trend to strengthen its presence in India.
But do you also think at the same time South Korea is also trying to cut down or reduce its reliance on China economically?
They hope, but I said that until last year that South Korea finally wake up. Because last year the South Korea found out itself in terms of the trade balances. China right now has the net positive vis-a-vis the South Korea. So the South Korea found out that it has a trade deficit vis-a-vis China, and there's no way for South Korea to recover. And in the past, China's market is such an important place for South Korea to reclaim all its trade, the trade positive in terms of the balance. So that losing China right now, South Korea desperately trying to find some other places to supplement all the deficits.
How does India see South Korea, Sana?
It's a very important part of India's Act East policy. The relationship with South Korea is not as mature as, for example, Australia and Japan right now. But there's a lot of economic cooperation that has been going on for decades. As Dr. Lai also mentioned, that there are several South Korean companies that have been operating in India and actually have become a household name. Like if you look at it, Samsung is perhaps used more than Apple in India.
Really?
So I think there is a lot of experience that could also be learned in Taiwan, South Korean experience. So definitely the relationship is moving towards a good trajectory, and I believe that there have been a lot of meetings between Prime Minister Modi and specifically with the South Korean president.
Do you feel Taiwan is a common concern? Because we've seen South Korea come out and be more vocal on Taiwan.
Yeah.
India isn't really talking about Taiwan, even though what has happened with respect to China. In, of course, closed door meetings, Taiwan has become an important issue for India. But if you just talk about how South Korea has become very proactive with respect to Taiwan, which was also not unimaginable a few years ago, it is primarily because there is a collective pushback against China's aggression in the Taiwan Strait. And second, I think there's a greater realization among countries. Of course, US has always been there, EU has been talking about it, then Japan, Australia, they were always cognizant of the fact that any dispute in the Indo-Pacific is going to impact their own security as well. But now there are countries such as South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, several Southeast Asian countries as well. They have become cognizant of the fact that China's aggression and China's invasion of Taiwan is also going to impact their security. And with respect to countries that have active territorial disputes with China, this question lingers that if today is Taiwan, tomorrow it could be them.
Right, and also on a larger scope, India is also a member of Quad. So how significant is India's membership in Quad?
I think it's very significant. First of all, without India, there could be no Indo-Pacific and there could be no Quad.
Right.
So the history of Quad goes back to 2004, when after tsunami, these four countries, navies of these four countries came together for rescue operation. But then, of course, China was a major factor how this was shelved in 2007, and China was again a major factor when the Quad was revived in 2017. So India is, of course, the only country in the region that could counterbalance China, and China is also very, very cognizant of this fact, and this is one of the reasons why the boundary dispute between India and China is also active. China wants to keep India preoccupied with this more than 70-year-old boundary dispute. So in fact, of course, all the four countries have said that the Quad is not a military or security grouping, it's just an informal grouping of like-minded countries. But if you look at India's role here, India is the only country that has injected the military component to the Quad. The Malabar exercise that was initiated and led by India has kind of now become the de facto Quad exercise. So India is playing an important role, and I feel that a lot of because if the democratic backsliding or whatever human right violation the Western newspapers come up with, despite all these things, India is one of the major player in the Indo-Pacific region and within the Quad.
Dr. Lai, you just came back from the Shangri-La dialogue. How much of a role did India have there, given tensions between the US and China and India's strategic location here?
Well, unfortunately, this Shangri-La dialogue this time, India wasn't much of the focus. And so are some other countries, because the Shangri-La dialogue, the people pay attention to the first thing is that how will U.S.-China competition, especially both the defense minister will be there, how that will play out. Second, how would the Ukraine issue be received in Southeast Asia and also in the other part of Indo-Pacific. And in that regard, the Shangri-La dialogue sort of present a very mixed pictures. Some countries, for example, like Indonesia, came out with a very specific peace plan, but it was criticized heavily by our European friends. And the third thing is that about the economic de-risking or the economic security issues. Not much of the country in the Southeast Asia had the appetite for that. And I think the prevailing message amongst many Southeast Asian countries still that they want to avoid themselves being caught up in the US-China competitions. And for that, some other issues such as Taiwan and so forth has been buried deep in those concerns and not raising by any single Southeast Asia countries, with the exception of Philippines, for example. But not many other countries, including India, ever talk about Taiwan right there.
Mm. And Sana, I want to go back to you for a little bit because you just talked about the importance of India and Indo-Pacific, of course. But Japanese Prime Minister had also paid a visit to India in the past 2 years and also mentioned that they're going to have a major investment to help develop Indo-Pacific. So do you think by this gesture or action, Japan is also inclining or having other alternatives to counter China?
I won't really call it as a direct outcome of China's aggression because India-Japan partnership dates back to 1950s. In fact, India was the first country to receive Japan's ODA. So I would say that both the countries have realized that there is greater alignment between Japan and India. And in fact, late Shinzo Abe, if you talk about the emergence of the Indo-Pacific construct in the modern time, he gave this landmark speech in the Indian Parliament in 2007 that was called as Confluence of the Two Seas, Two Oceans. So, he chose India to talk about the Indo-Pacific, and the centrality of India in the Indo-Pacific tells this volume about how Japan views India. So, of course, China is a major factor. They have been trying to provide alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative as well. We have seen how both the countries came up with Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. And then, in fact, Japan is the only country that is investing in India's somewhat volatile northeastern region. Mm-hmm. So, the level of trust between India and Japan is just too high. Mm-hmm. So, I won't just club it within this entire anti-China paradigm. Of course, these countries are really trying to provide alternative, but then it's just not limited to China.
But it is a component of it.
I think China factor is always there. When you talk about India, when you talk about Japan, you can't really get rid of this China factor, or I would call it China threat.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lai, I wanted to move to the U.S., given that Japan and the U.S. are staunch allies. And Modi has been extended an invite from President Biden and is expected to visit the White House. How significant do you think this trip will be?
I hope it will be significant. First of all, regarding India's role in the Quad, I will say that basically the Quad needs India more than the India needs Quad. That's how the dynamics itself play out. Of course, just as Sana said, that the Quad without India, there's no Indo-Pacific, the Indo part. And second, the India strategic community tended to see the Quad as a 3+1. The US, Japan, and Australia, they are the alliance with each other, but India is the one country outlier out there. Mm-hmm. And the India believe that the kind of the strategic value, especially in terms of the military value that the US, Japan, and Australia can bring for India in facing the land dispute vis-a-vis China is limited. At the same time that when India joined the Quad, it seems that India is required to devote its resources also to the issue in the Western Pacific. So that there are the kind of hesitancy among the India strategic community regarding how the Quad itself will play out, whether that much of the military role will be. So that's how the dynamics that has been existent within the Quad about the India's role there. And then the knowing those limitations or the India's hesitancy, the Quad now started to shift toward more of how the bilateral relationship, such as the Japan-India, US-India, and Australia-India, they can improve with each other, especially the Australia-India. Because the Australia is the country that the year 2007 or year 2008 that the Malabar exercises collapsed. The Malabar exercise in the past used to have the Japan, US, Australia, India all together. But precisely because of Australia's labor government out. And so the Malabar, the four countries joined together started to collapse. And India remembered that because that leaves India out cold there and facing the Chinese West. And so this time that the Australia-India relationship, especially the Labour government came back and how this the summit meeting will be able to be held has a very strong indication about the strategic trust between India toward the Australia, and that could be resumed. And India's visit to Modi's visit to the United States also has a similar effect. But of course, India and the United States already have numerous summer meetings. They do not need this one in order to confront something, but the reassurance value, especially in face of the war in Ukraine, and how to face China, and how to develop India as well. Those three are main objective. I believe that it will be the focus during the Modi's visit to the United States.
And Taiwan will be on the table.
I doubt it, because the India still, even today, openly refuse to talk about Taiwan. But of course, India's attitude started to change a little bit after the Nancy Pelosi's visit and the Chinese blockade exercise against Taiwan. The India started to issue about concern without naming Taiwan, but everyone knows that it's about Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Lai, and thank you, Sana. Rath also spoke to Riley Walters, Deputy Director of the Japan Chair at the Hudson Institute in Washington. Walters is an expert on both Japan and Korea ties with the U.S. He spoke about Japan and India's role in the U.S.-led democratic alliances.
Riley, so we've seen a series of U.S.-initiated events from the G7 on to Quad and also to IPEF. What is America achieving in this?
I think it's important to point out that it's not just America who's leading this. The G7 was hosted in Japan by Prime Minister Kishida, and there is really strong alignment between the United States and Japan on a myriad of issues, whether it's security or economic, which are generally two of, I think, both countries' priorities right now, especially when we're talking about China. One of the things that we saw out of the G7 was this focus on economic coercion, and the Japanese have been concerned, I think, of recently that China will be using its economic might or its economic heft in the future to implement more economic coercive measures for its political gains, like we've seen against Taiwan in the past or against Australia. And the United States is concerned about those things as well, and that's why they use language such as decoupling or de-risking, whatever they want to call it these days. But there's definitely, I think, interest in both Washington and Tokyo and other countries, particularly among the Quad countries, the US, Japan, India, and Australia, to build more resiliency, whether it's in our defensive capabilities, whether it's for our economic interests. One of the things that we saw just this past weekend, or just the week following the G7, was a meeting of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where they had an agreement on supply chain resiliency, and that included the US, Japan, India, 11 other partners of these IPEF negotiations, to kind of look into supply chains, look at ways to build resiliency, increase communications, and potentially avoid future supply chain disruptions.
You mentioned India. India is one of the largest manufacturing houses in the world, and many say that it could be an alternative to China. How powerful is India's participation in IPEF?
It's extremely important. There is a lot of hope that India could, definitely take some of the manufacturing out of China and put into a country where there's less, let's say, geopolitical concern. It's definitely, I think there's just recently a number of announcements where even Chinese manufacturing is increasing in India. It's definitely an area where there's perceived to be a lot of opportunity, but it's also, I think, all across Southeast Asia. We talk about Vietnam as a partner, we talk about Malaysia as a potential partner, both countries members of the IPEF negotiations as well, and also members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP for short. So there's definitely looking at these either emerging markets or Southeast Asian markets, however you want to characterize them, as potentially offsetting this reliance on China. That's for Japan in particular, which for the last several years has been looking at economic security. One of their main goals is to make sure that Japan isn't overly reliant on any one particular country for production in case they were to, of course, have some sort of geopolitical tension. China, of course, being the main target of this.
Given that Prime Minister Modi was also in Hiroshima and it was in all these meetings that you mentioned, do you feel that India will be eventually forced to take sides in terms of the supply chain restructuring and siding more with the US, as it's been part of the non-alignment group in the past?
I don't think there should be too much difficulty in this, discussion around supply chain resiliency and India's position as a country with no alignment. Um, that being said, economic issues can be pretty finicky. They often come back to actually domestic issues, and one of the reasons why I say India is, I think, a potential for taking manufacturing out of China. And I say potential because domestically speaking, I think they do have a lot of regulatory burdens that still exist that make it difficult to just, to see this wave move out of China into India. I think companies are looking at India as a possibility, but they still understand that investing in India still has its risks. And so, the more that India can not necessarily think about alignment with other countries, but actually look at ways to open up its own market for opportunities for foreign investors, to remove barriers and non-tariff barriers to its economy. That is probably the best way to think about this, in that they have the potential, but the change starts at home.
What does this all mean for Taiwan? As you talked about Japan. Taiwan's not part of IPEF, but Japan's been very supportive in Taiwan's membership in the CPTPP and integrating it into the larger democratic-led supply chain.
Japan is very interested in the future of Taiwan. I think the United States is as well. We have this new agreement between the United States and Taiwan as a part of their trade negotiations that are ongoing. I think what's interesting about Taiwan is not just, of course, its importance in the global supply chain, but of course the geopolitics that surround it.
If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section.
We're now at the last section of our show. Let's hear from George Ng, Research Associate at the Harvard Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. He is an expert in international relations and security, and also the editor of the Chinese version of the book, JFK, A Vision for America. George, are countries being forced to pick sides as U.S.-China competition intensifies?
I think yes, in a sense, that's right. But also at the same time, there is also a game of neutrality being played now. Specifically, for instance, China is quite worried that for instance, the European countries, might be, taking the side of the U.S. And as a result, now China is pushing for this narrative that maybe Europe should stay out of trouble and pursue a strategy of equidistance, basically maintaining neutrality, in the context of U.S.-China great power competition. So so I think to a certain extent, yes, countries are being forced to take side, but there is also this I guess hidden element or hidden dimension of this conflict or diplomatic maneuver over neutrality.
How successful has China been in terms of pushing for neutrality?
I think also yes. I think there's some success, but
is that seen, say, with Macron's visit?
Yes, exactly, precisely. Yes, Macron's visit, and also recently France's rumored opposition to NATO opening up an office in Tokyo. So you could say there is some success, but generally, and I would need to confess that I'm not an expert on Europe, but given the data that I have seen, European public opinion now is turning more and more is now becoming more and more wary, of China.
Do you feel that we're entering a new Cold War, given these different ideologies and how China's been inconsistent in its policies?
So I think this is, in a sense, really a matter of like zeitgeist or psyche. Because I think it's very difficult to make historical analogies. History, there might be similarities, but history, doesn't repeat itself, right? And so, in terms of a Cold War, I think it's important to first note that if you talk to a lot of American policymakers, they would categorically reject this narrative that U.S. and China is entering into a new Cold War.
But in substance, do you feel that it is a new Cold War?
So let me turn to that. So if you look at Beijing, right? If you look at materials and announcements from Beijing, you do get a sense that people in Beijing are thinking of U.S.-China great power competition as essentially a new Cold War, right? And this is important because sometimes politics is about impressions, it's about perception, it's about psyche, as I have mentioned. And in that sense, we could say that there is an emerging Cold War.
In terms of Chinese expansionism, many are beginning to see this, but Taiwan has lived with the threat of a Chinese invasion for over 70 years.
Right.
Do you feel that this threat is actually becoming real? Some analysts say that China could attack by 2025.
Right. So I think, of course, the threat is real, but I think we need to think about this from two different angles. So the first angle is essentially China's campaign to squeeze Taiwan's space, right? And not just diplomatically, but also militarily, strategically, and economically, right? For instance, recently, just a few weeks ago, there was this announcement by Beijing, saying that China will now start investigating the preferential tariff treatment of Taiwanese goods exporting to China, right? So that's a squeeze, and that's a real threat that we are facing every day now. And of course, all these attempts at changing the status quo, in the Taiwan Strait with Chinese jet fighters, encroaching, Taiwanese airspace, or all these naval operations, which very recently, resulted in almost collision, between the Chinese naval vessel, and the American naval vessel.
But do you feel it could attack Taiwan in the next year or two?
So I think in the next year or two, in terms of immediate attack, I don't think that's very likely. But the probability, I reckon, could go up in the next 5 to 10 years. And there are two reasons behind that, I think. So first, Chinese capabilities are increasing. So of course, we can't conflate capabilities with intention, but but oftentimes capabilities do fuel one's ambition, in international politics. So that's the first reason that it would increase the risk. A second reason that might increase the risk of war between Taiwan and China in the next 5 to 10 years is the decision-making is associated with the decision-making process in China.
Beijing.
Yeah, in Beijing. So right now, Xi Jinping has centralized a lot of power, and so some scholars in America, when they look at Putin's war, on Ukraine, they talked about a Putin syndrome, when it comes to dictators. Basically, the idea is that if you have someone who concentrates a lot of power, it could be very difficult for that leader to get the correct information when it comes to making policy decisions, specifically foreign policy, decisions. So now, given Xi Jinping's concentrated power, one worry is that he could become, on the one hand, he's very powerful, but on the other hand, he could become increasingly blind and erratic. So that's potentially a very big risk that Taiwan would have to face.
Right, because it's concentrated within one person.
Yes. And now we are only starting to see, the system where Xi Jinping has really concentrated, all the power, after the 20th Party Congress. And furthermore, if I may, just to add another point, we also have to start thinking about, okay, what would happen to China after Xi is gone? Xi is not going to stay in power, forever. If Xi is gone, given that all the power now is in Xi's hand, what would happen to China's political system? That could generate huge instability. That would become a huge risk, of war. So I would say, yeah, in the next year or two, I think likelihood of war is very, very low. But if you give 5 to 10 years, first given possible risk, inheriting the Chinese political system right now, and second, given if Putin syndrome, is a problem, we might actually see China adopting an irrational course of action, and we need to be prepared for that.
Indeed, so the risk is there. As the editor of the Chinese version of JFK: A Vision for America, George, how do you see lessons that we can apply from half a century ago from JFK himself?
I think in terms of war and peace, just following our previous discussion, I think one thing that I think there are a few lessons. So I think if JFK, is still alive, I think the first thing he would tell us is that peace is both very difficult, but also not as difficult as we might think. This, wars and conflict, they are man-made, right? So as a result, solutions to wars and solutions to conflict, they, should also be in the hands, of human beings. So I think there's that. I think we need to adopt a certain sense of optimism. I would say pragmatic optimism. I think that's the first thing. And second thing is that I think he would really emphasize the importance of empathy, in terms of dealing with conflict. So JFK gave a very, very famous speech after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the commencement address at American University, in 1963. And in this speech, he said, quote, "No political system is so evil that we would need to assume that the people who live under the system are also evil." I think that's something that we have to remind ourselves, maybe there's tension, maybe there's conflict, but we should have some faith, in the Chinese, in the Chinese population, and to a certain extent, maybe even in the Chinese leadership, right? And try to think through things also from their perspective, right? To see maybe the Chinese, maybe at times they can be irrational, maybe they can be very nationalistic, but that doesn't mean that Taiwan shouldn't take, a higher ground, right? And try to be empathetic and understand Chinese emotions and Chinese sentiments, and take advantage of that, to figure out a way to deal with China. So I think that's the second lesson, empathy. Third lesson I would say is beware of false dichotomies. So specifically, I think oftentimes there's a dichotomy, in international politics, the false dichotomy in terms of diplomacy, versus versus defense. If you want to practice diplomatic engagement, that's appeasement, right? On the other hand, if you want to build up your arms, that's that's war, that's showing muscle, right? And these are two different approaches. But I think JFK made it very clear, for readers who are interested, in taking a closer look at the book, that that's almost never the case in international politics. So I remember Teddy Roosevelt once said, the secret to diplomacy is you talk softly, but with a big stick, right? So in this sense, diplomacy, and defense or national security, they really come hand in hand. On the one hand, we should engage, but on the other hand, we should make sure that our engagement is based on, preparation.